In an earlier chapter of Genesis, before the reading that Ken shared with us this morning, in a vision, God promises Abram and Sarah, but in particular Abram, that if he leaves his current home and family, that he will show him a land where he will build from his descendants a great nation. It will be a nation, God says, where he will be blessed and where his name will become great and widely known. Fast forward many years, and Abraham and Sarah have not been able to have a child of their own. And Abraham is tired of waiting for the vision and promise of God to be fulfilled. And so he has a child by one of his servant women. But God returns to Abraham in another vision and says, "Don't be afraid. Your reward will be great." And Abraham more or less says, "Enough of your promises. Show me the money," or in this case, a pregnant wife. But God holds the promise to be true and suggests that his descendants will be so numerous that they will outnumber the stars. Abraham accepts the truth of God's promise once again, but still waits many more years before his son Isaac is actually born. And even then, it is hard for him to imagine a great nation coming from the descendants of his one son. It will, in fact, take years and years for God's promise to Abraham to come to fruition. Our Lenten journey is said to be a time to encourage us to take the long view of God's promises. It makes me think of the last few weeks that I spent with my son Jacob down south, and he was practicing and preparing for the coming season. And it's interesting, for all the years he spent being very analytical about his swing, like where his left-right index finger would fall on the grip of his left, you know what I'm saying. You know, what bend of the grass? Is it Bermuda grass or is it this grass? And depending on the dew on the grass during the and he's become a little more philosophical, I'd say, about his golf game. And he says, "You know, Mom, I have to realize that it's not one hole or one shot." He says, "It's the whole round. I have to wait to see the whole round play out, to see where I'm going." He says, "If I get caught up in one hole or one three-putt or whatever it is, it can be disastrous for the next number of holes that I play because I'm so ticked off that I missed that one putt. And it can be disastrous." But he said, if I just kind of think of this as the whole game, and I thought, you know, that's true in our lives, that sense of that perspective of having our whole life perspective, that we don't get pulled down into the one circumstance that we happen to be in at this particular moment. So I think that whole sense of our journey as a people of faith, to understand the long view of God's promise, just as Abraham had to understand. And I think it also raises for us the question of how do we live as a people of faith when the fulfillment of God's promises can sometimes seem so far away or even unachievable? And how do we live as a people of faith when the challenges of our lives seem to come and go, and we get over one and then the next seems to come, and it's like just wave after wave? And how do we live as a people of faith when those bad things happen, when our dreams remain unrealized and our hopes and dreams sometimes wither and our suffering seems too much to bear? Whenever I read the Psalms, I feel that they reflect so eloquently the challenges of people of faith who have lived before us and survived, even thrived. Often the Psalms are full of praise and thanksgiving for all the blessings of a life, and that at other times they are full of lament and woe for what is missing in a person's life, and their doubt as to whether or not God can even hear their cry for help. Psalm 27, read for us this morning by Ken, is just an example of one of those, although it seems to speak both of praise and doubt, thanksgiving and trust. Psalm 27 is almost cyclical, just like our very lives. We praise, we cry, we praise. We have good times, we have bad times. The good times come back again. Reverend John last week described some of those times in our lives as that wilderness experience. I've often said that in the difficult and more challenging times of my life that I'd like to have access to a fast forward button, you know, that we have on our PVRs or whatever, that we can just skip over certain scenes and, you know, cut the commercials, whatever, or see what's going to happen next, kind of like skipping to the last chapter and figure out where the story's going to go. Somehow I think that if we had a sense of what was going to happen next, we sometimes feel we could handle it better. Sometimes it is the fear of the unknown, the uncertainty of how long our suffering might last, and whether or not there truly is a light at the end of the tunnel that we find ourselves in, that is the hardest to deal with. I think facing the unknown and uncertainties of life can be very difficult and sometimes even frightening. After looking after my husband for the past 2.5 years at home as his health declined, I wondered how long I could keep managing. And then when his name came up on the wait list for an assisted living spot, I was so relieved that I knew I only had to hang on for a few more weeks until he would be provided with the full-time care that he needed. If we had declined the move, I realized I would not have been able to keep going without a clear sense of when the demands would end. John, you probably remember this, but a few years ago in ministry, there was a trend to offer sunset ministry or programming. The thought was that many people weren't signing up for things in the church because there was no end in sight. Once you volunteered, it was a life sentence. And with these young people, we figured, okay, that's why they're not coming in, because they think once they commit to one thing, we'll never let them out. I think as human beings like Abraham or the psalmist, we often struggle with being patient, especially these days when everything seems to be so fast-moving and we all demand instant gratification or results. We want same-day delivery, instant credit, Instagram, Snapchat, or our pizza ready in 30 minutes or free. The idea of having to wait is something that I think our society is increasingly challenged by. And yet sometimes that is what life gives us or what we end up experiencing. I think that as we get older, we realize the wisdom of waiting, of being patient. Although I shared this with the 9 a.m. folk this morning, and they all, I would say, were pretty much seniors and all agreed that, well, maybe with age, patience doesn't necessarily come any better or more easily. But I thought that with the prospective years, we elders realized that the impatience of our youth may not always have served us well. As we mature, we realize that sometimes it is necessary to wait. All good things come to those who wait. Do you remember that line? I realize now that if I go to a doctor's appointment, I don't mind when they say I have to wait. I think, oh, great. I pull out my book and I have some time to read uninterrupted. While on my leave, I knew I had to rest. And it was a clear intention of mine to listen to what my body needed and not to do anything that didn't serve to give me that rest and restoration. But by week 2, when I still had dark circles under my eyes and felt like napping every afternoon, even though I'd slept 9 or 10 hours every night, I was getting impatient. But I just had to keep trusting that things had to improve. And finally, one morning I got up and on with my day, and I knew that something had shifted. Something felt more normal. My energy started to return, and I began to feel stronger. And for the next weeks, I've moved closer and closer to feeling more myself again. But it took time, and I had to be a patient. Our faith journeys are like that too, I think. We can face difficulties and challenges that life gives us, and we can rebel or try to ignore what is happening. Like the psalmist, we can cry out in fear and anger at the injustice and doubt as to why this is happening to us. And like Abraham, we can wonder if we will ever realize our dreams, or if we should just stop holding on to hope altogether. And yet the scriptures tell us that that is a part of our journey. The wilderness times that we remember in this Lenten season remind us of the ebb and flow of life. The cyclical nature of our lives is not dissimilar to the seasons themselves. And one of the hardest things about suffering or waiting or the challenges in our lives is not knowing how long it will last. Unlike our fascination, whether or not the groundhog saw his shadow or not, how long will this winter last? When will the ice finally melt? When will spring arrive? When I went on my leave, I was first filled with grand ideas of all the things that I might get done on my time off. Yet I quickly realized that this was not the time of life for accomplishments and checking off items on my to-do list. It was, in fact, a kind of hibernation. In order to return to the spring-like experience of life and new growth, I needed to repose, to lie fallow and let the frozen earth of winter nurture me so that I could find renewed life and energy in the spring of my health. I had to trust in God's healing and caring spirit to surround me. And I realized I had to be on the receiving end of others' care and compassion and kindness. Like the Psalms, our lives go through the natural highs and lows of what life gives us. And as the psalmist reminds us that we are never alone. And like Abraham, that God's promises are true. God will give us new life, walk by our side, lift us up, protect us from all that would harm us, and lead us home. God wants to offer us shelter under her wing and a tent over our heads. And yes, it is sometimes necessary for us to be patient, to wait, to experience the cares and burdens of our world, and to seek God's face, to pray, to see and feel God's presence all around us in a sense of warmth in our hearts, in an awareness of peace surrounding us, in the kiss of a spring breeze on our cheeks or the song of a bird at sunrise, in the glowing hues of a sunset or the swift movement of melting ice in the river. Signs of God's presence are all around us. Take the time to be patient, to look for those signs, to be encouraged by them, trusting that God is with us in the waiting, just like Abraham and Sarah. And in that wait, we build our strength and courage to bear whatever burden life gives us, and time to realize the vision and promise that God holds for us. Wait for the Lord. Be strong, and let your heart take courage. Amen.